Oh, it's you again. Welcome back. Foreshortening is hard, very hard. And it was a glaring weakness of mine for like most of my career until I got tired of hearing people comment on my art saying that it was just too static. Oh yeah? I'll show you then. And so just a few years ago, I decided to turn this weakness into a strength. And well, in this week's episode of YouTube Art School, I'll go over everything that I practiced to go from static poses to these somewhat more dynamic foreshortened poses. But what is foreshortening? Foreshortening is when you get proportion changes because of the perspective. This probably means nothing to some of you, so here's an example. In this drawing, the hand appears huge compared to everything else, right? But I think we can all understand that it's not actually bigger. We just see it that way because it's closer to us, right? That effect introduces a lot of depth in the image and it makes it a lot more dynamic, like where the cameraman were right next to the character in the heart of the action. And doing that well is super hard though. It's hard enough to maintain good proportions when you draw characters that are just in static standing poses, but maintaining those proportions while taking into consideration how big or how small things should appear to be based on how far they are from the camera, oh, that takes the complexity up a notch or two. Honestly, it's probably what I find the hardest to draw, but there are some really important exercises that I started to work on when I got serious about learning it, and it really had a huge impact on me to the point that foreshortening feels a lot easier now. Now, it might be just because I'm a genius, or the exercises are actually really helpful, which is more likely, I would say. And everything starts with a box. I was already working as a senior artist when I decided to learn foreshortening, but I still got back to basics and started with this. So I wouldn't skip on this even if you think it's for peasants. My idea was that if I could draw boxes with foreshortening first, it's a skill that I would then be able to apply to more complex things like body parts. So whenever I had some downtime, like when watching TV or waiting for something, I started to practice drawing boxes in perspective. But not just plain boxes, because there are a few modifications that we can apply to a box to help foreshortening training. One classic one is to rotate the box as if it was floating in the air, like making sure it remains square. And this might be the exercise that had the biggest impact on me because you can do this with different basic volumes too. And it starts to shift your mind from seeing drawings as 2D shapes and more as 3D volumes that we can then organize however we want in space. But another variant that I think is very important for this is to start drawing multiple boxes existing in the same space. So having some of them that appear in front, some others that are in the back. That's harder. And then for that, you gotta make sure that your boxes are actually in 3-point perspective with vanishing points and not in isometric perspective where vanishing points don't exist. If your boxes have any of their edges parallel to each other, you're not drawing them in real perspective. This box is no good. And I'm not going to spend too long on this since I just released a class on perspective, but check it out with the link in the video description if you need a refresher on basic perspective notions. For this exercise, just keep in mind, it has to be in 3-point perspective, but it doesn't have to be perfect. You don't need to draw the vanishing points every single time. Anyways, another way to play with boxes that are super beneficial would be to start deforming them with twists and bends. And then there's one more exercise that I think is essential to learning foreshortening, and that would be to add and subtract from your boxes. So let's say, you start with a basic box. From here, we can really turn this into something completely different by cutting parts off of it, beveling a corner maybe, or cutting a hole through one, or extending the faces of another. Practice this stuff and the rest should come so much more naturally. Now, maybe you don't see the point because you can just take an easier path and just pose a 3D character and trace over it, or use that as a reference. But personally, I would just consider this as a crutch while learning to do it without, because there is an advantage to being able to draw from imagination. You can exaggerate things more easily because you'll understand how it works, and you'll get much faster at drawing those things. To me, that's worth it because it's a big part of my life. It's worth spending the time to improve that skill. Maybe it is to you too, but it's not to say that even I sometimes will still use references for client work, that needs to be perfect, or when the pose is particularly tricky. It's not that it's bad to use reference, it really isn't. It's the only way to learn and improve, really, but drawing gets so much more enjoyable when you can do most of it from imagination, or your memory, I should say. And there's definitely more to learning it than what we've seen so far. I'm about to get into this, but first let's take a break for a few seconds, because if you've been looking for help leveling up your art, learning foreshortening, anatomy, character design, and much more, of course my channel is a big help and you should definitely be subscribed. But if you're looking for a whole curriculum, the structure that's missing from YouTube, from start to finish, an equivalent to a full art education at a top university, I think you'll be happy to know that we're launching the spring sale for my complete art education program. So you should be able to get the art school program at a big discount until the end of this month. And you'll find all the information that you might need on it when you click the link in the video description. It's my proudest creation, so I had to plug it. Now, back to the video. So far, we've seen how much we can do with simple boxes or simple volumes, but that alone won't help us draw characters with foreshortening. So here's what comes next once you feel up to the challenge. We're entering the world of construction in art. So for this next step, we're gonna need to learn to build rough characters by assembling just a few basic volumes into a more complex structure. So it's almost like the box were the basic Lego blocks, and now we're about to use those blocks to build something else. That's really what construction is in the context of art. I show a bunch of different construction methods on the channel, but for foreshortening, I think one that uses cylinders and boxes will always work best because those are pretty easy volumes to draw in different perspectives. So check it out later if you think that might help. But once you settle on one, I would practice drawing again those basic structures or that basic construction for the body without foreshortening, if that's all new to you, but with the aim of eventually drawing them from different angles as if they were rotating in space. You know, kind of like what we did with the box at the beginning. So it goes drawing the thing or the character in a simplified way, using simple volumes like boxes and cylinders, then drawing that thing from different angles, but without foreshortening yet, to then drawing those basic volumes with foreshortening. And I did mention boxes are important, so let's bring them up here again because that's always what we're going to be using to measure things properly. And here are a few tricks that allow us to do that. The first is to find the center of any face. We can always connect the corners to mark the spot. So whatever box you draw for any of the faces, regardless of the perspective, you should always be able to find the center of that face. And another trick that you might want to remember is this one here. Let's say you want to make this length or this box exactly twice as long, or maybe just 50% longer. You can always extend a line from this corner, crossing in the center of that opposite edge, and that should give you the exact same length considering the perspective. And if you just wanted it 50% longer, let's say, well, we can find that center and then chop the extra. Pretty cool, huh? Combining those two should allow you to do a lot of different things. Because, yeah, boxes are overpowered when you realize everything you can do with them. And I'll always remember Kim Jong-gi mentioning that's how he's able to draw his crazy detailed scenes from imagination. He used to see everything he drew as if it was in a container box. Like, here I know the belly button lands right in the middle of my box, so if I draw this in perspective, I would know right away that this is half of my box and that it should be drawn right here. And I can use this as reference for the rest of the details as well. To be fair though, I wouldn't jump into drawing realistic characters with foreshortening until you can draw basic ones first. I think that goes without saying, but don't start with a final box, right? Instead, you can still create some really cool looking characters or cool looking drawings by adding just a bit of details to your basic volume structures. See? And like anything in art, the more you practice, the more things will click and the faster you'll get. And it's so fun to be able now to draw these really dynamic pieces that used to scare me so much just a couple of years back. It's a really cool skill that I think everybody should learn. And that's probably why you're watching this video. But yeah, once we've practiced with the more basic shapes, you should also be able to start adding back onto them all the details that we originally stripped away. And that to me is a much less intimidating way to go about learning it. Everything always starts super simple with basic volumes that are easy to draw by themselves. And then you can just form structures out of them and keep adding more details to it until you're satisfied. It's really like playing with Legos in your mind. When you start to think about it this way, it makes things much easier. Because the biggest thing when learning to draw foreshortening, I believe, is to rewire your brain to think like an artist, to start seeing 3D volumes instead of 2D shapes. And well, those exercises with boxes will do just that, allowing you to then tackle the rest that we just talked about. Give that a shot. It worked wonders for me, and then for years I've seen it work with my students as well. So at this point, I'm pretty darn confident that you'll get better if you try this. But if you've been using something else successfully, I'd love to know about that, so let me know in the comments. And before I end the class, in case you've been eyeing those sweet lines, wondering, what kind of amazing brush I've been using, well, good news, you can now download it for free with the link to my custom brush pack in the video description. I have the versions for Clip Studio Paint and Photoshop both. Also works in Procreate actually. And while you're on my QBrush store, don't forget to check out my art program.